Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Linux and open source news for the week. You might have seen on Thursday I misclicked and published a members only video for everyone. Sorry about that. It was not a marketing ploy, it was just me being very bad at my job. I guess for 20 minutes it gave a few of you a notion of what I put out for $1 per month. So you know what? I'm gonna use it as a marketing opportunity. Anyway, this week we've got Thunderbird launching a Thunderbird Pro and Thunder Mail subscription as a competitor for Office 365 and Gmail. We also have the owner of a large open source DNA database deleting it entirely, arguing that the world is currently not a really safe place for an open set of genetics data, which, yeah, that's kind of true. And we also have the EU taking aim at end-to-end encryption, because what they're proposing to vote on basically means that end-to-end encryption would just not be able to exist in its current form. So let's get started right after I tell you about our sponsor. This video is sponsored by Squarespace, your all-in-one platform to create, manage, and publish your own website. Squarespace has really easy tools to make sure anyone can end up with a nice-looking, well-optimized website, no matter if they know how to code or not. They have what they call their blueprint system, which lets you pick from a variety of templates that are pre-built and will suit any type of website, whether it's a simple blog, an online store, a video platform, whatever. On top of that, to go further, Squarespace has their own design engine to create your own pages. You can just drag and drop elements where you want them, and you can change the colors, the fonts, and just tweak the template however you want. And once you have something you like, you can add extra features like creating your own online shop, complete with a payment system that handles credit cards, PayPal, Apple Pay, and more. So check out squarespace.com/thelinuxexperiment, the link is in the description, so you can give Squarespace a shot, and you'll also get 10% off your first website or domain name purchase. So let's begin with Thunderbird, and it looks like they're going to launch a Thunderbird Pro service as a competitor with Office 365, but also a Thunder Mail service as a competitor for Gmail. Now, this thing would include appointment, something that lets you send a link to someone else through email so they can schedule an appointment in your calendar. So basically you set in your calendar the availabilities that you have, you send the link to that calendar to someone else, and they see all the time zones and the spaces during your week where you are actually available, and they can book a meeting with you. There's also Thunderbird Send, which is basically what Firefox Send was, so a large file sending service, except it's handled by Thunderbird instead, which makes sense because you're gonna send those links through email anyway, not through the web browser, so that works. There's also Thunderbird Assist, which is AI tools inside of Thunderbird. Apparently it's an experiment with Flower AI. It seems to be an open source federated learning network where the training happens on all the Flower AI instances that people set up in a private way. Thunderbird wants to do processing on device at least, and it will be optional, but they haven't really listed which features this would bring, which lets me think that it's just the usual AI hype without any real purpose. And finally, there's Thundermail, an email account based on the stalwart mail server. So you can create an email account straight from Thunderbird instead of having to set up an existing one. Now, people who don't have an email account are few and far between, but if you want to create a new one and you like what Thunderbird has to offer and you trust Thunderbird, then I guess that's as good a provider as any. This entire suite of services will be offered for free for regular Thunderbird contributors, so I'm assuming everyone who contributes code regularly, but also probably people who sponsor Thunderbird with their hard-earned cash, and it will be paid for everyone else. Once everything is worked out and the business plan is solid and well tested, they will open a free tier as well. Now, it is all very interesting stuff. It is another business model than what Thunderbird has been doing for years, which is just being funded by their community. I like the pure community-funded avenue because it means that if you do good stuff, you get funding. If you don't do good stuff, you lose that funding. So it gives you a very straightforward feedback loop on whatever you're working on and whether people actually want to pay for that. But also, diversifying your funding avenues is never a bad thing, and offering that kind of service still goes along the lines of you're being paid by people using your service. It's not like they're ad-funded. I don't really know what they plan to do with AI, maybe rewording emails, maybe doing statistics on your emails, I don't know. I'm not a fan of those features, but they will be optional, so it's not a big deal in my book. Now this week, the creator of an open source genetics database decided to shut it down entirely and to delete the entirety of the data as he realized that the contents of this database could be used by governments that tend to lean towards the far right recently, and anti-democratic administrations are starting to get more and more prevalent in the world, and so genetics data might really be misused. As the founder of this database called OpenSNP, the largest use case for this entire dataset was not research. It was from law enforcement agencies, which obviously opens up a lot of questions on why governments would want to know anyone's genetic makeup for law enforcement, because you could compare the DNA of someone you are investigating with what is in the database, but I'm pretty sure the contents of the database were all anonymous, so you probably couldn't get a name or anything on that. And apart from that, knowing what genes people have for law enforcement is never a good thing. Now, that database had been running for 14 years, it had collected 7,500 genomes, and it was basically a voluntary contribution from people who bought services from 23andMe, a DNA sequencing company that went under a while back. It's a decently large set, and it was all voluntary data. Nothing was collected in an untoward manner. The creator said that in a world where scientific data is being censored and deleted, and where certain people groups are being criminalized, it is no longer ethical to run that project. But he also says that it's pretty ironic to delete all of that scientific DNA data, just like the administration that is criticizing. But he also says that it's better to put people's safety first. Now, of course, that's probably not going to work because that was an open source database. Someone somewhere has a fork of it or a copy of it locally. You can't delete stuff from other people's computers in that manner. So this database will reopen if it hasn't been reopened already under a different name, and it will still be accessible and accessed by anyone who really wanted to access it. But I do understand the will to not being an active participant in some nefarious stuff that law enforcement agencies could do all across the world. Not saying all law enforcement agencies do nefarious stuff, but some of them definitely do, and giving them access to a lot of genetics data is probably not something I'd want to be involved in either. Now, we also have some worrying stuff in the European Union because it looks like the European Commission is set to weigh in on the currently raging debate on whether end-to-end encryption should even just be allowed, or if it should include a backdoor for government. So it should include a backdoor period, because you can't limit a backdoor to a government. Once you open a backdoor, it is accessible to anyone who can find it. Most European countries seem set on rejecting this stuff because similar laws have been proposed in a lot of European countries and have been turned down. But if the EU decides to vote that in, then they will have to comply with that directive. All member states will have to do it. So that's a pretty big problem. The Commission didn't directly say they want to end end-to-end encryption, but they said they would create a roadmap to identify and assess technological solutions that would enable law enforcement agencies to access encrypted data in a lawful manner that safeguards fundamental rights and cybersecurity, which is fundamentally incompatible with end-to-end encryption. If something is end-to-end encrypted, if you want to add a way for law enforcement to access it, you basically have to give them all the decryption keys, and that's just not safe. That's no longer end-to-end encrypted. At least as far as I understand it, there is no middle ground in there. It's either end-to-end encrypted and no one has access to anything, or it's not end-to-end encrypted at all, and then law enforcement agencies could get a look. But there is no middle ground in this. Correct me if I'm wrong. Now, the European Commission would also introduce a new Cybersecurity Act to basically force member states to implement cybersecurity laws into their own local law. That's how the EU works. It writes a directive, it votes on a directive that member countries then need to write themselves into their own law as they see fit. And the EU then verifies that these local laws follow the letter and the spirit of the ones that the EU wrote. Now, this is all very worrying because right now the EU is widely seen as a place where user privacy is mostly respected and an important right, but once you start opening that backdoor into encrypted data, you know it's gonna get wider and wider, and the people getting access to it, the set of people getting access to that data is gonna get broader and broader. This always happens. You start with a very narrow definition of who might even get access to that, and then all of a sudden that definition gets wider and wider with small laws here and there, and at some point everyone can read anyone's data and there's basically no limit. And plus you have a giant backdoor open that any malicious hacker or potential foreign threat might want to access. So it's definitely not a good thing, and what the EU wants to do isn't to end end-to-end encryption, but what they're proposing law enforcement agencies have access to is basically fundamentally incompatible with encrypted data anyway. Now let's talk about Wayland versus X11 performance, because Phoronix did a comparison of just that. They compared Wayland running with GNOME and KDE versus X11 on more lightweight desktops like LXQt and XFCE, because some of their readers told them after another benchmark that they did, a gaming benchmark where Wayland outperformed X11 on GNOME and KDE, some readers suggested that maybe a more lightweight desktop environment would perform better on X11 than the big ones on Wayland. So Phoronix did that testing again for gaming, and it turns out that's not the case. Wayland on GNOME and KDE was pretty much entirely on par with or better than X11 on LXQt or XFCE. It was almost always a tight race, but there were no instances where X11 was really better in any capacity. And this also tracks with a video I'm currently working on, where I'm comparing the performance of all desktop environments running on the exact same distro base, but using either Wayland or X11 depending on the session they recommend. Wayland simply does not have a performance penalty any longer, at least when you're using open source drivers. All my testing and all of Phoronix testing is done on AMD graphics drivers. I'm sure that if you look at NVIDIA, they don't have all that great X-Wayland support or Wayland support in general, and so you might have more differences. But on Intel or AMD, it looks like X11 just does not have the edge in performance anymore, even if you default to a more lightweight desktop environment, which in my video I found just doesn't matter in the slightest for any real use case anyway. Stay tuned for that video, it should come next Tuesday if I have the time to finish it, but it's almost done, so it should come next Tuesday. Now, Ubuntu had been experimenting with compiler optimizations to build more performant packages, but after a bunch of trials, they decided to not automatically use these compiler flags with all of their packages because it looks like these optimizations actually make a lot of stuff perform worse. For example, they cite GNU Radio and TIFF image decompression. These dropped performance by 12% with the optimizations turned on. And the size of all the packages compiled with the optimizations increased on average by 6%, meaning the desktop ISO itself grew by 4% in terms of size. So Ubuntu developers concluded that these O3 optimizations do not result in better performance, and they tend to even regress performance in certain tasks. Plus, it affects load times up to 12% because executables just get bigger when compiled with these sets of optimizations, and so they take longer to launch and to store in memory, and everything takes longer to do. They say these optimizations are not a sensible default, even though they can help in some cases, so they will selectively apply these to the packages that benefit instead of doing a blanket optimization pass. And that's interesting to remember. There is no magic wand you can wave at packages and a Linux system and get 5 to 10% better performance without doing anything else. Nothing really works like that. It all depends on the code, how the package has been built, how the program is written itself. So obviously you can't do it. If you could get 5 to 10% better performance at the expense of 5% bigger executables, I'd say the trade-off is worth it for a lot of people because we really need more resources than we really need disk space these days. But for most people, that's not happening with these optimizations, and so it's nice that they just aren't brute forcing their way through it to save some time. Now, I don't expect the packaging format being used to matter that much in that kind of data, so debs versus RPMs, for example, or Arch packages, but I would be interested to see whether these distros have the same performance loss or the same gain in terms of disk space when applying the same optimizations. Now, in terms of privacy, Apple was hit by a 150 million euros fine in France over their app tracking transparency framework. And this fine seems really counterintuitive at first, because the App Tracking Transparency Framework, or ATT, is what lets Apple show a pop-up when you open a new application, and that pop-up will ask you if you want to let the application track you or not, and use your data to serve you personalized ads. France found that this thing could be detrimental to smaller app publishers. Now, since Apple implemented this ATT framework, all app developers had to ask users for their consent before collecting any data and targeting them with personalized ads, which is good. There should be consent for this. The issue that France found is that the implementation doesn't meet the GDPR requirements at all, because app publishers need to display 2 pop-ups to gather consent. One from iOS and then one from the application itself. So users have to confirm consent twice, but to refuse consent, they only have 1 click to do on any of these pop-ups, any of the 2 pop-ups. If they click no, this is just forgotten. So that pattern is not neutral. Now, personally, I don't have an issue with consent being harder to give than refusing to consent to data collection. I don't think that's an issue whatsoever. Where the problem lies is that Apple gives themselves a much smoother path to data collection. Basically, Apple's own applications just do not follow the same rules. They do not ask for consent, they always get it because you use an Apple account, and if you want to disable all that data collection, you have to know that you can disable it, go into the settings of your device and disable it. But you never see the same pop-ups that Apple forces onto their competition. So that's a clear case of monopoly abuse. Apple dominates the iOS App Store. They are the only option right now to download applications, and forcing application developers to gather consent twice when they don't gather it even once basically means that they have a lot more data on their users, and so their ad network is way more appealing than anything else that could exist in terms of competition, and so obviously Apple gives themselves an unfair advantage. Now, the 150 million fine is completely insignificant to Apple. They won't even feel it. They haven't even issued a strong rejection of the thing. They basically are like, yeah, sure, yeah, here's your check, leave us alone. They probably even provision these kinds of fines somewhere in every annual budget. They know they're gonna get fined, but they don't care. That amount is just way too small to be of any impact on this company. You need to multiply it by 10 or 100 for it to actually matter for Apple. And let's conclude this episode with some gaming news. Just one piece of gaming news. It is about Command & Conquer Generals. It's currently undergoing a Linux port because the source code was opened recently by EA for that older game. This is obviously a fork of the original Command & Conquer, and it's being done with help from the developer of Lux Torpeda. This is a tool that lets you swap the original Windows-only engine of a game that you might run with Proton for a Linux-compatible engine. For example, if you're running Morrowind with Lux Torpeda, it's going to download and use Open Morrowind instead of the original Morrowind engine, Gamebryo, that has been used by Bethesda ever since. Lux Torpeda will support playing Command & Conquer Generals with its Linux build of the engine, and the extension 0 Hour will be supported too. Now, it's still work in progress. Obviously, the codebase hasn't been opened for long by EA, so it's still a lot of work, but it's really nice to see this effort already. And honestly, just for game preservation purposes, I would love to see game publishers doing the same thing with games that they just don't sell anymore, or sell so little that it's not really a big problem. If some games in your game catalog are 30 years old and they don't even run properly on recent computers, open up the source code. Someone will revive them. You can still make a remaster or a remake and sell that, but you can also just open the 30, 40-year-old codebase and let people keep having a version of the game that still runs on modern hardware and adapt it and mod it and find fun in it. This doesn't cost you a thing apart from opening up the source code and maybe cleaning a few things off if you need to. It's not that complicated, and if EA, the most hated company in gaming, can do it, any publisher really can. Now what you can do is take a look at our sponsor, Tuxedo Computers. They offer Linux desktops and laptops. The main advantage is that you know that they've done the work so that all the hardware works well with Linux. They even write drivers that they are upstreaming to the kernel when they're ready, so they're actually doing the work to make sure that all of that stuff works perfectly. I only use their computers these days. Everything that I do for the YouTube channel on Linux, for this podcast, for my other YouTube channel, everything I do in terms of gaming is done on a Tuxedo computer. They have a big range of devices that will cover every price point and every need, with a lot of customization options for the hardware, the look, the keyboard layout. They're just really, really solid. So as always, the link is right down in the description. Go check what they have to offer. They're really awesome. Okay, that will be it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed watching it or listening to it. If you did, you know what to do. There are all the usual YouTube buttons down here above the description. All the links that I used are in the description, and there are also links to get access to members-only content. You can do that on Patreon or on YouTube. It's a little bit more expensive on Patreon because you do get background playback and an RSS feed that you can plug into any podcast player. But in both cases, it's either $1 or $2 per month for a lot of members-only content. So check that out if you want. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I guess you'll see me in the next one. Bye!